With 23 titles in the last 30 years, Formula One would seem to have been most recently dominated by the British. That wasn't always the case in the history of Grand Prix racing, in fact, far from it. French manufacturers were the main pioneers of motorsport, and so were French organisers. For it was the Automobile Club de France who organised what is largely regarded to be the first Grand Prix way back in 1906. Run on closed roads near Le Mans, it was won by a Renault driven by the Hungarian Ferenc Sis, who beat the Fiat of Felice Nazzaro. A year later, the latter took his revenge at Dieppe. And a year later again, Germany scored a 1-2-3 when Lautenschlager won in a Mercedes ahead of the Benz of Hemery and Henriot on the same circuit. Thus, the scene was set. For the next 50 years or so, French, Italians and Germans would battle for supremacy. After the heroic age of the city-to-city races at the end of the 19th century, the first Grand Prix were disputed by cars that were still primitive, but already powerful. In spite of a pleasant, warm and sunny day and a slippery surface, Sis's Renault's average speed was over 60 miles an hour. 70 years would elapse before a Renault would enter a Grand Prix again. The occasion was the British Grand Prix at Silverstone on July the 16th, 1977. It may have been symbolic, but it was a return to racing that would prove to be tough, particularly as it aroused as much sarcasm as interest. That was because the Renault Elf RS01 was powered by an innovative 1.5-litre V6 turbocharged engine. At that time, all other Formula One cars were powered by normally aspirated 3-litre engines. That is to say, twice as big as the little Renault, as laid down by the regulations. According to the engineers of the time, this was too great a handicap to the turbos. But for the moment, Renault were coping with the constant development pains of their new engine and those who mocked their imprudence.
Traditionnellement, les turbocompresseurs équipent les camions, les bateaux, les tracteurs, les engins de chantier, mais jusqu'à présent, il équipait pas très souvent les moteurs à essence et très peu les moteurs à essence très fortement performants comme les moteurs du Mans ou de Formule 1. Donc nous nous sommes heurtés à des inconvénients, je dirais, technologiques uniquement liés à notre jeunesse dans cette technologie. Nous nous sommes heurtés donc à notre propre incompétence, à dessiner les pièces qui résistaient aux très fortes pressions, aux très fortes températures qui sont générées dans ce moteur. Et nos sous-traitants ont eu le même mal que nous à mettre au point les pièces qui nous fournissaient, comme les pistons, les segments, les turbos eux-mêmes, etc.
In spite of the setbacks, Renault persevered.
La période de mise au point du moteur 1500 a été très longue et bien entendu nous sommes passés par des périodes très difficiles, disons où nous avions conscience que nous avions la possibilité de faire quelque chose, mais où les progrès malgré tout étaient très lents. Et là je dois dire que nos ingénieurs, eux, n'ont jamais perdu confiance et ça c'est très important de le dire, ils ont toujours cru que le moteur Renault Turbo allait battre les moteurs atmosphériques.
Renault's first Formula One driver, Jean-Pierre Jabouille, scored their first World Championship points with fourth in the 1978 American Grand Prix, and then went on to score their first win in the French Grand Prix at Dijon. It was an historic double, 72 years after Sis's victory in the inaugural running of the same event. When Alain Prost, the great hope of French motorsport, joined the team in the early 80s, everyone thought that their golden boy would be the final element that could eventually bring the World Championship to the French manufacturer and its Formula One team. Backing up that view was that turbocharging was clearly the way to go. Every other Formula One team had a turbocharged engine. So, technologically speaking, Renault had won. But that was as close as they got to the title. They never finally managed to lift the title, which would have been the icing on the cake. Even so, the Renault Elf Turbo was undoubtedly the car to beat between 1981 and 1983. Prost and teammate René Arnoux started from pole 10 times in 1982, but they won only 4 races, suggesting a lack of reliability which the team never quite overcame. However, the Renault Sport engineers steadily overcame the drawbacks associated with turbo engines, such as the problems of detonation, turbo lag, and the sudden arrival of power, which could make the driver's task so difficult. Unfortunately, the progress in technology was not accompanied by similar progress in the structure and organization of the team, which was top-heavy and ponderous. 3 seasons running, Prost was in contention for the title, and he should have won in 1983. But Renault was beaten in the end by Piquet's Brabham BMW, and the French team would never recover from such terrible disappointment after 6 years of intensely hard but ultimately fruitless work.
Pendant pas mal de temps, chez Renault, ils n'ont pas assez cru les pilotes. Moi, en l'occurrence, à un certain moment, comme moi je demandais pas mal de choses, on m'avait interdit l'entrée de l'usine parce que on considérait que je dérangeais. Et puis on m'a dit un jour, on m'a fait la réponse, d'ailleurs c'est pour ça que moi je suis parti de chez Renault, que moi j'étais peut-être pressé de gagner des courses, mais qu'eux ils n'étaient pas pressés. Donc quand des responsables disent ça dans une équipe de Formule 1, ça veut tout dire. Donc moi je suis parti, et puis ils ont dégoûté tout le monde. Alain m'a remplacé, et puis ils ont dégoûté Alain. Moi, franchement, j'ai même cru qu'ils allaient être champions du monde avec Alain, parce que quand je suis parti, je leur ai dit qu'ils ne seraient jamais champions du monde. Franchement, ça a été du gâchis. Pour moi, ils auraient dû être champions du monde au moins 2-3 fois.
The Renault Turbo era thus ended in frustration and bitterness when, at the end of 1985, a serious crisis caused the French company to wind down its Formula One involvement. Even so, it had much to be proud of. 29 pole positions, 20 fastest laps, and 15 victories. And if nothing else, Renault's innovative step and their emphasis on marketing and public relations meant that Formula One reached an audience and attained a popularity which it had never before enjoyed. But their campaign lacked that final crowning glory, the title, and Renault didn't want that failure hanging over them. So once their finances had been sorted out, the French company re-entered Grand Prix racing at the beginning of 1989, this time as the engine supplier to the English Williams team. By this time, the rules had changed and the 1.5 turbocharged engines had been replaced by 3.5-litre normally aspirated units. Renault designed and built a V10 for this formula, and it would soon be the engine to beat. Finally, in 1992, helped by an advanced suspension system, Williams-Renault and driver Nigel Mansell won the constructors' and drivers' titles, deposing the McLaren-Honda team. While Renault could boast victory in the first ever Grand Prix, Alfa Romeo could lay claim to winning the first World Championship back in 1925 and taking victory in the first Formula One Grand Prix and the inaugural Formula One World Championship in 1950. The Milan manufacturer's early success coincided with the debut of its P2 in 1924. This was the work of the famous Vittorio Jano, dismissed from Fiat by one of the Alfa Romeo team drivers, namely Enzo Ferrari. The heart of the P2 was the magnificent 2-litre 8-cylinder twin-cam engine, which supercharged gave 155 horsepower, more than 75 horsepower per litre, which wasn't bad at all for the 20s. The P2 story is inextricably linked to Antonio Ascari, who, having given the car a victorious debut in its first race at Cremona, went on to win the French Grand Prix at Lyon and then the Italian Grand Prix, completing a triumphant trio of races for Alfa Romeo. Sadly, Ascari would be killed in his P2 the following year while leading the French Grand Prix.
Cette Alfa Romeo P2, elle a couru aussi en 1925, où elle a gagné le premier championnat du monde de l'histoire. C'est un peu un drôle de championnat du monde, c'est un championnat du monde par marque. Le pointage était un peu drôle parce qu'une victoire donnait 1 point, une deuxième place, si je me rappelle bien, 2 points, etc. Et une voiture qui ne participait pas à la course, elle prenait automatiquement, je crois, 8 ou 10 points, quelque chose comme ça. Donc à la fin de l'année, c'était la marque qui avait le moins de points, qui était championne du monde. Donc Alfa Romeo gagne le premier championnat du monde. Et c'est depuis là que, autour du badge Alfa Romeo, il y a cette couronne, justement pour marquer ce championnat du monde.
Later, modified P2s were run by a new team, one Scuderia Ferrari, which would expand further when it was officially asked to run the P2's successor, the P3. This was a proper single-seater. The riding mechanic's seat was dispensed with, and the driver's seat was centrally mounted, thanks to a new, innovative transmission system. Power was transmitted to the rear wheels by two drive shafts, which formed an inverted V because the differential was fitted to the back of the gearbox. Jeannot's 8-cylinder, twin-supercharged engine gave 215 horsepower in its 2.6-litre version, then 260 when bored to 2.9 litres. Light and beautifully balanced, the P3 was quicker than both the Bugattis and Maseratis. But the might of Germany, in the shape of Mercedes' Auto Union from 1934 onwards, was a different matter. However, Nuvolari gave Alfa a glorious swan song by winning the greatest of his races, the 1935 German Grand Prix.
Ce Grand Prix d'Allemagne, c'est un peu la course qui a marqué la P3 parce que c'était déjà un peu une pauvre voiture, si on veut parler comme ça, une voiture qui avait déjà plusieurs années. Elle a réussi à battre les Auto Union et les Mercedes-Benz. Bon, elle ne les a pas battus directement. Ces voitures allemandes ont eu des tas de problèmes techniques, surtout des problèmes de pneus, ce qui a permis à Nuvolari de gagner la course.
But sheer heroism isn't enough in motorsport, and just before the start of the Second World War, a new Alfa Romeo appeared. This was the famous Alfetta, but because of the hostilities, it would not begin to make its name until 1947.
La 158 è nata a Modena, progettata dai progettisti Colombo Gioacchino, Massimino e Bazzi. Erano i tre capi della Ferrari. Poi nel 1938 Ferrari da Modena è passato all'Alfa Corse di Milano. Naturalmente venendo a Milano ha portato la 158 all'Alfa Romeo.
The Alfetta would become one of the most famous cars in Grand Prix racing, thanks to tremendous success in its two versions. First of all, there was the 158, which won the first Formula One World Championship in 1950 in Farina's hands. Its 1.5-litre engine, 8 cylinders with two-stage supercharging, gave 300 horsepower. That is, more than 200 horsepower per litre. The 158s won every one of the 11 races in which they ran in 1950, including the 6 Grand Prix, which counted for the new World Championship. Then, a new, even more powerful version appeared for 1951, called the Type 159. This extraordinary machine reached the peak of supercharging technology. We are still in the 50s, and yet this remarkable 1.5-litre 8-cylinder engine gave 350 horsepower and then 425. That is nearly 300 horsepower per litre, and the car's top speed was over 300 kph, 186 miles per hour. Thanks to progress, Alfa Romeo followed up their previous year's title won by Farina with Fangio's first of 5 world titles, one driving the superb Alfetta.
Era una macchina molto nobile, è un gruppo di lavoranti che lavoravano molto forte sulle macchine e questo era lo principale. Sì. Il ricordo sono molto bello. Sì. Sono 2 anni che sono corso con loro e ho vinto il primo campionato 40 anni fa.
But this kind of technology had reached its limit, and the 4.5-litre normally aspirated Ferrari would take over. Alfa pulled out at the end of 1951. Its less glorious return to Formula One in the 70s and 80s did nothing to eclipse the glorious career of the Alfetta. The other great manufacturer of the 20s and 30s was that of Ettore Bugatti, the most illustrious member of a dynasty of very talented craftsmen who established himself in the Alsace area of France, having emigrated from Italy. An expert in engineering, the family's creative streak led him to design his cars as works of art. His masterpiece was certainly the incomparable Type 35, which, from 1924, was the first production Grand Prix car. Over a decade, around 400 models in various versions were produced. In the latter half of the 20s and early 30s, the Type 35s made up the majority of the field, either driven by professionals or amateurs. And it was thanks to this car and its variations that Bugatti has one of the most illustrious records in Grand Prix racing, on a par with Alfa Romeo, Ferrari, Lotus and McLaren. The Type 35 made its debut at the European Grand Prix at Lyon in 1924. The regulations allowed for a maximum engine capacity of 2 litres and a minimum weight of 560 kilos. The Bugattis were immediately the sensation of the field with their lightness, balance and aesthetically pleasing shape and size. There were several innovations, not the least their cast aluminium wheels, whereas everyone else used wire wheels. But these proved to be the team's downfall in this European Grand Prix, for the wheels required special tyres, which had not been sufficiently tested beforehand. But this was only a temporary setback. Ettore Bugatti's masterpiece would go on to win many races in the years to come. Bugatti eschewed the supercharger to begin with, and the Type 35's original 2-litre straight-8 engine, however beautiful it may have been, only developed around 100 horsepower, while its rivals, thanks to supercharging, developed considerably more. The fact that the Type 35s were able to challenge cars with perhaps 50% more power was thanks to their excellent road holding. However, in the end, Bugatti followed the trend and took the supercharging route as well. So the Type 51 of the early 30s had a 2.3-litre engine which gave 170 horsepower. Even so, the Bugattis continued to be competitive thanks to their easy inbuilt simplicity, which made them not only efficient on all types of circuit, but also allowed amateurs to buy them and race them with success during these crazy years. Fifi Étincelin and his legendary cap worn back to front was the archetypal gentleman driver of the period, typical of the driver who found success in the 30s in spite of not being in a factory team. Chiron, Varzi were also helped on their way by driving Bugattis, while René Dreyfus, Robert Benoit and the Williams were among so many others who found themselves behind the wheel of one of these agile machines, neither revolutionary nor very advanced, but which benefited sufficiently from the simple mechanical intuition of the man who designed them. While the production side of Bugatti's racing was one of his company's more lucrative operations, Mercedes' involvement in Grand Prix racing was all about the company's and its nation's image. That was why the German firm's participation was only occasional, unlike Bugatti's before the war and Ferrari's after the war. In all, Mercedes launched 3 well-reasoned offensives, 2 before the 2 world wars, largely for propaganda reasons, and 1 in the 50s to demonstrate that after the defeat and destruction, the company and country were back on their feet again. But apart from the motivation involved, there was also one fascinating characteristic which linked these 3 periods, and that is that they were all very successful. No other major manufacturer so successfully obliterated the opposition each time they went racing. The first chapter of this trilogy covered 1914. Mercedes hadn't had much success against Renault and Fiat between 1906 and 1908, but now returned in force for the French Grand Prix. Peugeot, revolutionary with brakes on all 4 wheels, were the favourites, while the 4.5-litre German cars were more conventional with brakes on only the rear wheels. But it was the latter team that won, the tough cars finishing 1st, 2nd and 3rd. A few weeks later, war broke out, and only the memory and significance of that victory remained. The second chapter began with the arrival to power of Hitler in 1933. Immediately, the Führer encouraged German manufacturers to start building Grand Prix cars, which would demonstrate that the Third Reich was capable of dominating Europe. The famous Dr. Ferdinand Porsche designed the revolutionary Auto Union, with its V16 engine mounted between the driver's back and the rear axle. Mercedes, however, went for a more conventional design, and their approach turned out to be the more realistic and efficient. Their front-mounted straight 8-cylinder engine developed 325 horsepower, which was around 100 per litre, more than any other engine at the time. The 1934 W125 was also the first Grand Prix car to be equipped with independent suspension and hydraulic brakes. The German steamroller, enjoying greater investment than ever before, began to obliterate the lightweight French and Italian opposition in the second half of the 1934 season. The age of the Silver Arrows was nigh. The auto unions, however, were very difficult to drive. Dr. Porsche had been right to mount the engine behind the driver, but he was many years too early. It would be another 25 years before Cooper got it right and won with this layout. But the two German firms continued their private rivalry and spent vast quantities of money in their attempt to reap the rich rewards promised by Hitler for the best German Grand Prix car. In 1935, the Mercedes W125 was giving 400 horsepower against the 375 of rivals Auto Union. The next year, however, in spite of more than 500 horsepower and a new, lower and more compact chassis, they were less successful due to a lack of reliability. But they took their revenge in 1937 with an engine pushed to 5.6 litres and now giving more than 650 horsepower. Never before had Grand Prix cars been so quick, now capable of more than 300 kph, nearly 190 mph. But that pushed the governing body to limit engine capacity for the 1938 season.
Mercedes a décidé de faire une 3 litres 12 cylindres avec compresseur et de nouveau il y a eu un pas important dans l'histoire, c'était la première voiture à double compresseur. Donc le 3 litres donnait autour de 400 chevaux à l'époque et je pense déjà on tournait entre 8500 et 9000 tours. Elle consommait, une voiture comme ça, une trentaine de litres d'huile par Grand Prix. Et la consommation de l'essence, qui était une essence très très spéciale, dépassait de loin les 100 litres par 100 km de course.
It was finally the war that brought to an end the fantastic run of success enjoyed by the Mercedes steamroller as they vied with Auto Union for national honour. Between them, they had made the late 30s one of the most remarkable periods in the history of motorsport. After their formidable racing cars had conquered Europe's motor racing circuits, the Third Reich's equally impressive war machine set out to conquer the continent. The great campaign of the Silver Arrows may have reduced Grand Prix racing to Nazi propaganda, but it was also one of the most impressive epochs in motorsport. The final chapter in the saga of Mercedes in Grand Prix racing took place 15 years later, when the W196 revived the Silver Arrows legend at the French Grand Prix at Reims. This time, Mercedes' engineers had gone for innovation to show the entire world that the company had become the prestigious flag bearer of the re-emerging industrial Germany.
Io credo che questa macchina era una macchina di avanzata. È nato dopo la guerra, motore desmodronico, non aveva nessun costinetto di metallo in nessuna parte, vuol dire che non si poteva rompere. E questo è molto importante per un pilota che sa che la macchina non si rompe. Solamente io pensare alla sua persona e portarla in fondo. Sì, sì.
The cars had all-enveloping, streamlined bodywork for fast circuits. The engines featured direct fuel injection, another first, and desmodromic distribution, a rarity. Mercedes was again well-funded and strengthened its chances by employing Juan Manuel Fangio and Sterling Moss, the best two drivers of the time. Immediately, there was no contest. The German cars won 10 of the 12 Grand Prix in which they raced during the 1954 and 1955 seasons. The team, still ruled by the iron hand of Alfred Neubauer, had the great fortune to enjoy much greater finance than that available to its rivals. To ensure its success at any price, Mercedes used a steamroller to overcome rivals which were no greater than mosquitoes. Tragically, in June 1955, a Mercedes sports car left the road at Le Mans and killed nearly 100 spectators. At the end of the season, the German company pulled out of motor racing. After the war, motorsport restarted using whatever was available. In Italy, the pre-war Alfettas had been well hidden, and in 1950, when the governing body created the Formula One World Championship, Alfa Romeo was ready. The 1.5-litre, 8-cylinder engine, complete with two-stage turbocharging, now produced 370 brake horsepower instead of the 195 produced before the war. It would soon exceed 400. There was another difference. Released by Alfa Romeo, Enzo Ferrari had created his own team. That would become the backbone and be synonymous with Formula One for many years to come. They produced a normally aspirated 4.5-litre V12, which developed 350 brake horsepower. It may have been a little less powerful than the Alfa, but it had the advantage of being somewhat less thirsty, which meant that it could compete a full Grand Prix distance, while its rivals would have to refuel 2 or 3 times. Ferrari's 375 made good use of its advantage in scoring the team's first race win in the championship at the British Grand Prix in 1951, bringing to an end the Alfetta's victorious run. Beaten again in Germany and in Italy, the Alfettas were finally outclassed, and at the end of the 1951 season, Alfa Romeo decided to retire and rest on the laurels of their second world title rather than risk tackling a season too many. It was a blow for the championship, for Ferrari and their star driver Alberto Ascari were virtually without rival. In an effort to boost the fields and future Formula One regulations, the governing body decided to accept Formula 2 cars, but Ferrari were unchallenged. So in 1952, only the impecunious Gordini team attempted to challenge the intensely competitive Scuderia Ferrari, who ran the 500 model powered by a 2-litre 4-cylinder engine. This car would win every Grand Prix of the year, perhaps not as incredible a feat as it might have been, but one that hadn't been repeated 40 years later. The Ferrari 500s did almost as well the following year, but this time their success was more praiseworthy, for Ferrari's quartet of Ascari, Farina, Villaraci and Hawthorn came under increasing pressure from Maserati's Argentine trio of Fangio, Gonzalez and Marimon. And while the title may not have been at risk, Ferrari's 500 ended up giving best to Fangio's Maserati in the final Grand Prix of the year. And that would end Ferrari's monopoly in Grand Prix racing. Over the next few years, Ferrari would be more and more seriously challenged. Mercedes pummeled all opposition into the ground in 1954 and 55, and then Maserati and Van Wall took over in challenging the Scuderia. Then they missed the boat when it came to the technical revolution begun by Cooper at the end of the 50s.
Propose a Ferrari subito di fare la vettura a motore posteriore, ma lui non la volle fare subito, perché anche lì lui sentiva l'opinione di tante persone che dicevano che la Ferrari, avendo il motore anteriore, di produzione, le vetture di produzione Ferrari, avendo motore anteriore, che anche lei guidava, non doveva mai fare una vettura a motore posteriore in corsa, perché se vinceva annullava i requisiti benefici della produzione. Mi ricordo il consiglio verso Ferrari del vecchio Taruffi, si ricorda l'ingegnere Taruffi, che lui chiamò per sentire al solito il parere, e lui gli disse: ma guardi che qui ormai non c'è niente da fare, la strada è quella del motore posteriore, è inutile, non si può chiamare. E allora dette il permesso di fare la vettura a motore posteriore.
Ferrari's about turn coincided with the introduction of new Formula One regulations in 1961, engines limited to 1.5 litres unsupercharged. Ferrari's 156, powered by a V6 more powerful than the English 4-cylinders and characterised by its shark nose, would redress 2 humiliating seasons for the Scuderia when they were soundly beaten by what the proud engineer would call the English Assemblatori. However, the latter weren't giving up easily, and Moss routed the might of Modena at Monaco, thanks to his nimble Lotus and his own talent. The 156 powered Phil Hill to the World Championship crown, but it would not be followed up by more success. One would have to wait until the early 70s and the magnificent 312B for a successor. Its flat 12-cylinder 3-litre engine, known as a boxer, could be fitted to a very low semi-monocoque chassis. The car largely dominated the second half of the 1970 season and the start of 1971 and should have taken Jackie Ickx to the championship. It did prove that accusations of the conservatism often directed at Ferrari weren't always justified.
La Ferrari ha introdotto moltissime novità, ma alla Ferrari non si fa la pubblicità. Alla Ferrari non si dice noi abbiamo fatto questo, perché è la Ferrari. Io ricordo che siamo stati, è la Ferrari che ha introdotto l'alettone sulle macchine. È la Ferrari che ha incominciato a fare le vetture con un forte effetto suolo quando le altre macchine erano strette. Quando abbiamo fatto la spazzaneve, tutti hanno riso. La spazzaneve è stata la T sperimentale. Quando la T è uscita, noi abbiamo vinto tutto. Ma non hanno detto che c'era buona la tenuta di strada, hanno detto che avevamo molti cavalli. Quando vogliono diminuire i meriti della Ferrari dicono che ci sono molti cavalli.
If one omits the Formula 2 period of 1952 and 53, Ferrari's finest hour was with the 312T, the final letter indicating that it was equipped with a transverse gearbox behind the flat 12-cylinder 3-litre engine. This family of cars raced from 1974 to 1980, and its various versions brought no fewer than 3 world titles and 30 victories for drivers Lauda, Regazzoni, Reutemann, Villeneuve and Scheckter, as well as 4 constructors' titles. The 312T marked the golden age of Scuderia Ferrari in Formula 1. But Formula One's history has always run in cycles. At the end of the 50s, Ferrari, the most famous and long-standing of World Championship entrants, was shown the way by just one of those assemblatori, of whom he was so disdainful. That man was John Cooper, whose father began by building tiny single-seaters in a small garage in Surbiton, on the outskirts of London. Built for the motorcycle-engined 500cc class, the Cooper's cars were notable for their engines mounted behind the driver, the lightweight tubular chassis and their low price, which allowed British drivers to benefit from what were, essentially, the first Formula cars in which they could cut their teeth on the way to greater things. Thus was created a whole host of drivers and engineers who formed the base on which was built Britain's superiority in motorsport, which began in the early 60s. One of the most promising graduates of this school was Stirling Moss, who was a teenage purchaser of a Cooper 500. Appropriately then, Moss scored Cooper's first ever Grand Prix victory, his car powered by a 2-litre Coventry Climax in Argentina in 1958. It outclassed the front-engine Ferraris of Musso and Hawthorn in spite of a 500cc handicap. For the first time, the Italian Goliath would have to give best to the English David. Thus began a new era in Formula One. But it was Jack Brabham more than Moss who symbolised this new era. He was Cooper's works driver, and it was he who claimed the world title in 1959 and 1960.
We went on to prove, really, that the rear-engine car was going to be there to stay because it did have a lot of advantages over the front-engine car. From a traction point of view, weight distribution, getting the weight over the rear axle, and being able to put the power on the ground because most of the front-engine cars couldn't put the power on the ground. The development of the engines, you get a lot more horsepower. If you can't put it on the ground, that's not much use to you. And rear-engine car does really help put the power onto the road.
At that time, general feeling ran against the idea of rear-engine cars simply because it hadn't worked with the hard-to-handle pre-war auto unions. It was thought that the reason the cars handled so badly was because of the engine's positioning. But the Cooper's success proved that to be false. In spite of a fairly basic tubular chassis and a less powerful engine than its Italian rivals, the Coopers proved that low weight and manoeuvrability could compensate for a lack of power, particularly on the most demanding of circuits. The Coopers rewarded Brabham's forceful style, which sometimes surpassed the car's own limits of road holding. And they responded magnificently to Stirling Moss's somewhat gentler and more precise style. Brabham's success during the 1959-1960 seasons encouraged every constructor to adopt the rear-engined layout. But while Cooper had arrived at this layout as a logical step, Lotus founder Colin Chapman took the format beyond the bounds of even the most imaginative designer. Chapman, quite simply, was one of the great geniuses of motorsport who would take his theories to the limit and constantly sought solutions to the most imaginative ideas which would mark 2 decades of motorsport. Chapman's Lotus 18 was a sort of refined Cooper, still with a multitubular chassis, but its successor, the 25, was the first monocoque chassis in Formula One, a chassis made of stressed, shaped aluminium moulded around bulkheads, and while not an original Chapman idea, is still the basis of Formula One chassis today.
C'est la première voiture qui représentait une approche de la sécurité passive en Formule 1. Le fait que cette voiture monocoque ait réussi et se soit imposée, que cette technique se soit imposée, a peut-être sauvé des dizaines de vies de pilotes, parce qu'avant, le châssis était une structure multitubulaire et en cas d'accident, les tubes se pliaient, se cassaient et hachaient le pilote qui était à l'intérieur. Et c'est pas du tout d'ailleurs dans ce but spécifique que Chapman a fait la 25, c'était pour avoir une voiture plus rigide, plus légère. Mais il se trouve que tout de suite, quand on a vu cette voiture, Jim Clark, quand il est monté dedans, il a dit « Je ne monterai plus jamais dans une voiture qui ne soit pas monocoque ».
The great Jimmy Clark never drove for another team but Lotus in Formula One. He won 19 races and his 2 world championships came driving first of all the neat Lotus 25 and then its successor, the 33, the 2 most advanced cars in the early 60s. His driving was almost insolent in its apparent ease. Colin Chapman was entrusted with the first Ford Cosworth DFV V8 engine in 1967, and he designed the Lotus 49 around it, using the engine as a stressed member, again a first in Formula One.
See if it'll motor car. I hope so. So do I. Yeah, that's fitting well. Beautiful. Yep, that's the job. Lovely.
The chassis itself had a strange look. It finished right behind the driver's back and the rear suspension was part of the engine and gearbox assembly which was designed to take it. It was also a weight-saving solution which Graham Hill put to good use by winning the 1968 World Championship. Jim Clark took the Lotus 49 and its Cosworth engine to a remarkable debut victory at the Dutch Grand Prix in 1967, and the car and its derivatives would go on to win 12 Grand Prix in 3 seasons, in the hands of Clark, Graham Hill and Jochen Rindt. But more than that, it was the inspiration for other constructors in Formula One, rather as the Lotus 25 had been in building their cars for the new 3-litre formula introduced in 1966.
C'est sur la 49 que l'on a vu apparaître les ailerons pour la première fois. La première apparition d'ailerons en Formule 1, c'est Monaco en 68, et c'est sur la voiture de Graham Hill qui d'ailleurs l'a emporté. Il y avait 2 ailerons à l'avant et il y avait un capot arrière en forme de déflecteur.
Chapman's message soon made its mark.
À la course suivante, qui était le Grand Prix de Belgique, Brabham et Ferrari ont été un cran plus loin que Chapman en mettant des véritables ailerons, non seulement à l'avant, mais à l'arrière aussi. Et aussitôt, Chapman a repris l'avantage. Il a mis des ailerons à l'arrière qui n'étaient plus fixés à la voiture, à la carrosserie, mais qui étaient fixés sur les porte-moyeux, qui étaient donc mobiles.
But now Chapman and his fellow constructors began a trip up a dangerous blind alley as they developed bigger, higher and more fragile wings, which, when they failed, caused horrific accidents. The governing body had to put a stop to it, and quickly. But the basic idea was an extension of the use of cars' aerodynamics. No longer was it simply important that it cut through the air with ease, but that it was pushed down onto the ground to give it better grip. Chapman was the first to realise this with his designer Maurice Philippe and their joint production, the Lotus 72. It was in a Lotus 72 that Jochen Rindt died in practice for the 1970 Italian Grand Prix. But he would become posthumous world champion that year. Then it was Emerson Fittipaldi's turn to profit from the extraordinary potential of this innovative and revolutionary machine. Its shape not only produced a remarkable amount of downforce, but moving the radiators from the front of the car to the side pods made a significant change to weight distribution to the rear, which in turn improved traction and grip. Once again, this inspired concept from the fertile brain of Colin Chapman would be adopted by all his rivals. But the 72 was so advanced that it enjoyed an exceptionally long career, seeing service over 4 seasons. It was obviously a distinguished career as well, for this car would win more races than any other in the World Championship, winning 17 Grand Prix in the hands of Rindt, Fittipaldi and Ronnie Peterson. It became the JPS Special for a while, adopting the name of its sponsor. But the Lotus 72 helped Fittipaldi to the first of his 2 World Championships in 1972. But then, things turned sour.
C'était une voiture qui était faite pour marcher avec des pneus conçus spécialement pour elle, compte tenu du fait qu'elle avait un poids non suspendu extrêmement faible à l'avant. Et à l'époque, Chapman était avec Firestone, qui faisait des pneus spéciaux pour la 72, ce qui lui a permis de remporter ses succès. Et puis, Firestone s'est retiré de la compétition, Goodyear est venu, et Goodyear a fait des pneus pour tout le monde, puisqu'à l'époque, ils étaient les seuls fournisseurs de pneus. Ils ont fait des pneus standards qui ne convenaient plus du tout à cette voiture.
Chapman's last technical gift to Formula One before dying of a heart attack at the start of the 80s was the idea of using ground effect in Formula One. This comprised creating a depression beneath the car which would literally be sucked down onto the road. It was first seen on the Lotus 78, which appeared at the start of the 1977 season, but it suffered a lack of reliability. However, once again, Chapman and his associates, Tony Rudd and Peter Wright, had succeeded in eclipsing their rivals. Chapman had basically gained on 2 fronts. Downforce was no longer obtained by the wings. These were simply used to balance the car, so there was less drag. In order to produce the lack of pressure under the car, the side pod's undersides were shaped in order to accelerate airflow from the front to the rear of the car, and the extremes of the side pods were fitted with sliding skirts to make the sides airtight. The grip that this produced gave phenomenal road holding, and with it, Mario Andretti and Ronnie Peterson completely dominated the 1978 season. By winning 6 Grand Prix, the American took the World Championship ahead of his Swedish teammate, who would be tragically killed in the Italian Grand Prix, a race that was becoming the team's black spot after Rindt's accident in 1970 and being blamed for von Trips's in 1961. Once again, Chapman had caught his rivals unawares. But once again, however, less innovative but more painstaking rivals would catch him and overtake. After Chapman had died, one wondered who would become the guru of Formula One. At the start of the 80s, McLaren became the dominating force in Formula One. It had been founded in the 60s by the New Zealand Grand Prix driver Bruce McLaren, a former Cooper driver who had decided to go out on his own, but had been killed in testing in 1970. Co-directors had continued to run the team successfully, as demonstrated by the 2 championships won by Fittipaldi and Hunt in 1974 and 1976. But then success had dried up. The team was no longer a front runner when it was taken over by an ambitious team manager, Ron Dennis, who had the foresight to gather some talented and powerful people around him. There was the iron-handed designer John Barnard and the wealthy Mansour Oj with his company TAG, or Techniques d'Avant-Garde. Between them, they supplied the ultimate weapon, the MP4 chassis, fitted with a 1.5-litre V6 turbo engine, developed, built and run exclusively for them by Porsche. But the most important innovation was the use of super-light carbon fibre to build the monocoque rather than aluminium, as well as the car's Coca-Cola bottle shape, which would soon be copied by other teams. The TAG Porsche-engined McLaren MP4s first of all took the 1984, 1985 and 1986 championships with Lauda and Prost. Technically speaking, these cars had the most developed and most efficient chassis, as much in terms of stiffness as aerodynamically. The engine remained one of the best throughout 1984 and 85 and would remain one of the most reliable as well. The combination of the engine chassis and Dennis's reliability meant that this was one of the most successful periods of any team in Grand Prix racing. Dennis had raised the standard of team organisation to unprecedented levels. He had managed to raise a substantial budget, but in return for this, and also because of it, he used all his motivation and his purest ideals to go about the business of motor racing in a much more detailed way, tackling each and every job with greater care and professionalism. But by raising that standard, everyone else now had to seek greater budgets in order to attempt to rival his team, and the price of victory was so high that few could afford it. Dennis had to pay dearly for his TAG Porsche engines, but Hondas, while just as competitive, were a great deal cheaper.
We were in a customer-supplier relationship. We were the customer, they were the supplier. As in any customer-supplier relationship, we were paying, they were receiving our money, and they were making an engine to our specification. At the time, it was an immensely successful program, but it was becoming apparent that it was not possible to finance to the level that was going to be required the 3.5-litre normally aspirated engine that was due to be introduced in '89. We chose to open discussions with Honda, and those discussions were based on the philosophy of our respective companies and the desire to have a real partnership. It was a sort of total commitment that you make, similar to a marriage. You know, it's for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, all these things. And that was a sort of level of commitment that we made.
And so continued the extraordinary run of success for the McLaren MP4. There was a brief interruption in 1987 when Williams Honda briefly took over, but in spite of the departure of Barnard, the original father of the MP4, the car's younger brothers and sisters remained competitive. From 1988 to 1991, the McLaren Hondas would win a further 4 consecutive titles, 3 for Senna, 1 for Prost. Unprecedented. Indeed, the sheer statistical success of the McLaren MP4 makes one reel. Between the McLaren TAG's first win at the 1984 Brazilian Grand Prix and the McLaren Honda's last win at the 1992 Australian Grand Prix, 9 seasons, these cars won 4 drivers' titles, 6 constructors' titles and 69 Grand Prix, an average of 7 wins per season for almost a decade. And that average rises to 9 per season if you take it from 1987 to 1992. Never had a team, and certainly not a car, spent so long at the peak of Formula One, a sport which, until Ron Dennis took over McLaren, had always seen constant swings and changes in power. Just as Chapman had been the master of technology and Ferrari has persevered for so many decades, so Ron Dennis, in terms of organisation, has left his mark on Formula One.